Nicole Rosie is the Chief Executive of WorkSafe New Zealand. Nicole joined WorkSafe in December 2016 from Fonterra, where she was leading a major shareholder value project and was also acting General Manager for Risk. Prior to Fonterra, Nicole managed strategic relationships at Vector, was General Manager for Policy and Safety at Kiwi Rail, General Manager Risk and Strategy at Toll NZ, and General Manager Health and Safety Environment at Transrail. She also has experience with WorkCover Queensland and ACC and was Health and Injury Prevention Manager at Fletcher Challenge Forests. So please welcome Nicole Rosie. Thank you.
Hey, good evening everybody, and thank you for having me here tonight. It's great to see such a good turnout. So what I thought I'd do, first of all, I've been with WorkSafe now for 6 months, and I want to really keep it simple. Why did I come to WorkSafe? Because I've worked in multiple New Zealand businesses. I've seen dramatic changes in those businesses through a focus on this area, and I think we can do way better in New Zealand. So I've come to WorkSafe because I believe very strongly in New Zealand, care very deeply for New Zealanders, and I believe we can make a big difference. And the type of thing that is happening here tonight is exactly how we're making that difference. So let's talk about that first. There is a lot of evidence that things like this charter are making a difference to New Zealand health and safety, and actually Graham, who's not here tonight, spoke about this at a meeting we had yesterday and just talked about the fact that actually surveys in New Zealand show that safety awareness and safety culture in Canterbury is much higher than the rest of New Zealand, and that's largely attributed to the charter and the work that this charter is doing. So don't underestimate what you're doing, not only for the construction sector, but for transforming what is a very poor health and safety performance in New Zealand. We still three times worse than Australia on most of our indicators and 6 times worse than the UK. So each of those statistics sounds terrible, but when you put it into people, that's even worse, isn't it? That's brothers, sisters, etc., mothers not coming home. So keep up the good work. You're doing a really great job. What I want to talk about today is a couple of things that will be very close to your heart. I actually see a bunch of these sitting over on the left-hand side as your critical rules. But I want to talk about 2 areas that I think are the game changers in New Zealand, certainly in the immediate term. And the first is critical risks. So this is data actually from US, Australia and New Zealand, and it shows what's happened in trends around health and safety at a sort of macro level, I guess, over the last few years. And what it shows is that big organisations and entities have been focusing on lost time injuries and medical treatment injuries, and we're actually seeing quite a big drop in those. And for those of you that are big businesses, you'll understand the terminology of TRI, so total recordable injuries. For those that are not, those are basically people going to a doctor or having a week off work with an injury. So they together make your total recordable injury rate. Lots of big businesses and many businesses actually in New Zealand have focused heavily on reducing their total recordable injury rate over the last few years. So they report to their board all the accidents. And actually what we've seen is quite a nice downward trend in that. What we've also seen is that actually that has very limited, if no, impact on fatalities. And if anything, fatalities have increased. And if you throw on top of that health-related death, you'd probably see a similar trend, particularly as asbestos exposures that happened 20 years ago. We're now seeing the consequences of that with people dying from mesothelioma and asbestos-related illness. So this trend is really worrying globally, and I'll talk to you a little bit about why that is. So a lot of health and safety theory over the last 30 to 40 years, a lot of the practice, particularly out of leading organisations, US, etc., has been based on a thing called the bird triangle. This is the bird triangle. Those of you that will have worked for big organisations probably have talked about this in the past, but basically the bird triangle was based on a bit of research by a guy called Bird. Hence the reason the bird triangle. He wasn't a bird, his surname was Bird. But he looked at about 12 million actually incidents, I think it was. You can look him up online, do a bit of a Google on him. But he looked at about 12 million incidents in about the 1930s and 40s, predominantly in the US. But out of that study, he came up with an approximate ratio. And he said for every one fatality, there's approximately sort of 10 to 30 serious harm injuries, 100 to 300, less serious injuries like people with ankles, rolls or back injuries. And so he gave a ratio. Now that work that's all he did. He just came out with a ratio that said, when I look at the data, this is approximately what happens. For every one death you have around 30 serious harm injuries, and for every 30 serious harm injuries you have approximately 300 injuries. Now business took that data and they went, wow, if we can eliminate those bottom end things like those ankle sprains and back injuries and lost time weeks, we will eliminate our risk of death and fatality. So that drove a lot of behaviour in the US in terms of what business is focused on. So number one. Number two, in New Zealand, the whole ACC scheme has been based off MTIs and lost time injuries, because actually you make a claim when you have a week off work. If you die, it's actually cheaper under the ACC scheme. So sadly, a lot of the financial incentives in New Zealand have been around less serious injury and a focus on less serious injury. The bird triangle has been proven to be incorrect. In other words, if you eliminate all your risk of death, of minor injuries back, you will not necessarily, and actually categorically you won't, eliminate your things from your workplace that cause death and serious harm. Because there's a number of things that you never see in your MTIs, or see your medical treatment injuries and your lost time injuries that could be fatalities. So, for example, you don't tend to get too many sprained ankles from plane crashes. You actually don't tend to get too many minor injuries from falls over 3 to 4 metres. It's quite catastrophic. You're dead or you're seriously injured. So the latest thinking, this was a bit of research that was done in 2012, and it looked at a number of New Zealand, American, Australian companies, is that actually what you need to do is focus on, within your data, looking at within the triangle the 10 to 15% of things, it's actually up to 30% of things, that can be precursor events to death and serious harm. So there's only 10 to 30% of things that are appearing in your minor injuries that will ever result in death and serious harm. So the first thing is to understand what those 10 to 30% of things are. And there's quite a lot of research on that. I've actually got 2 slides that are missing from here. But you can't see this, so this is, not the regulator trying to be misleading. It's just that the regulators make errors as well, and I deleted the 2 slides I was meant to keep in. There they are here. So this is actually Australian data, and this is actually American data. You can't see it, but it's basically the causes of death in Australia and America over the last 3 or 4 years. I'll tell you what they are. Look at your critical risks over there, by the way. Number 1 cause of death, vehicle accidents in Australia. That is number 2 in America. Number 2 cause of death, falling from heights or working from heights. That is by far the number 1 cause of death in America, by far. Number 3, struck by an object, which you could argue is sort of coming under the heights one in New Zealand. Also number 3 on the trapped by a moving object machine is number 3 on Australia. So, and actually they make up 80 to 90% of the causes of fatality in America and Australia, and actually New Zealand as well, as it happens. So actually the things that cause death and serious harm are quite similar throughout the world. They are not necessarily showing up in your data as lost time injuries or medical treatment injuries, and you need a different approach to them. So the way that you manage your minor injuries is quite different from the way that you manage these things that can cause catastrophic harm. So the reason that this is important, and it might seem like for you guys it's not really an epiphany, but I went around, when I started in this role, I went around 50 odd employers in New Zealand, and they all got their CEs and lots of their senior team, and they presented their wonderful health and safety performance to me, and almost all of them presented it in their TRIs and LTIs. Almost all of them. I said, well, that's great, but what are your critical risks? Probably less than 50% of them could name their critical risks. You guys are way ahead on that. So less than 50% of them, of our significant employers, the ones with better health and safety performance that I spoke to when I went around New Zealand, could name their critical risks. And then within that 50%, when I said to them, what's your key controls? Probably about a third said, I've got lots and lots of signs out there, lots and lots of signs. So I can ask you a question. You guys are experts now. You've been doing this charter for 3 years. Falls from height. If I look at this diagram here, what's my critical control for fall from height? Anybody got an idea? Yell it out. Come on, it's not that late in the day. Elimination, so what's an elimination control or a substitution control? What is it? One, yes. Well, yeah, no, but see, if you're building a 3-storey building, that's pretty tough, isn't it? That would be your number one, but number two would be, it'd actually be some form of physical protection, so it's your scaffolding or harness. And lots of people think that their primary form of control is the permit to work system, which is actually on this diagram, the administrative controls. Actually, what this says is when you ask employers about where their efforts are focused in terms of this control hierarchy, 61% of efforts are focused below the line, 38% are focused above the line. In actual fact, the only way to substantially reduce the risk of harm from these critical risks is to be working above the line. And I'll give you a very, very explicit example of that. 10 to 15 years ago, when I was working in the forestry sector, there was a problem with felling. There was lots of deaths happening in the sector, and how did the industry respond to that? They responded to that by training their people and putting them in chaps. What happened to the death rate in the forestry sector from felling? 5 years ago, there was a review, given there was increased economic activity and there was increased deaths in the sector. So their controls were all at the administrative end of the equation and fundamentally didn't change the picture at all. When you're at the administrative control level, and this is what the study says that was done in the 2012, you need 7 controls. So you need signs, training, some sort of pre-shift brief, some sort of standard operating procedure, 7, for it to be effective as a control above the line. And you need to be exercising those controls every day that you're exposed to the risk for it to be as effective as a control above the line. So another context for you around that, if I'm talking to the agricultural sector, which I just did last week, and we talk about quad bikes, the way New Zealand's currently responding to quad bikes is to put helmets on people and start to talk about training quad bike operators. Do we actually honestly believe that will substantially reduce the risk of death and harm? Put your hand up if you've never had an accident in a car. It's usually 1 or 2, which is the people I was going to employ. The reality is there was no hands in the room, right? So the one thing you can be absolutely certain of is that human beings will make mistakes. So if you're relying on the human in the room to not make a mistake, then your system is fundamentally flawed. And when you're in the critical risk space, the paramount of having controls in place that actually work on the assumption that the human will make a mistake is absolutely fundamental if you are going to reduce or eliminate risk. So that's the first message. Focus on this stuff. It's really important, and work really hard on your critical risks, but also on understanding what your key controls are and testing those controls. Which brings me to the second point, which is around engaging your staff. Because when you're in this critical risk space, actually, you're not dealing with things you can actually see. So if I go back to Pike River and I say, what's the number one risk in a coal mine? Critical risk. Any ideas? Methane explosion, right? Do you tend to have many methane explosions coming through your TRIs and MTIs? Not really, eh? So what you're actually focused on is your key controls, right? So in that context, your key control would be your methane monitors. You're reporting on how often your methane has been spiking, how many incidents you'd had of sparking cell phones or whatever going into the mine. Now, there was at least 6 incidents prior to that explosion of methane in the mine at above explosive levels, and the system alarming. So was the board focused on the right stuff? Were the leadership focused on the right stuff? Were they asking the right questions? No, they weren't. So if I go to your critical controls over here, and I'm now talking about engaging your staff, when you're working at heights and you have a critical control, say of scaffolding or some form of other form of fall protection, how do you know that your staff are actually following that? And when you're in a highly interdependent workplace, how would you know if there was a whole lot of other people not following that process or procedure? Well, the only way you know is actually if you have highly engaged staff that feel very, very confident about raising, failed controls. and also a culture that supports that to be acted on in a really positive way. So I'm going to use another example. Fonterra just done amazing things on health and safety, but my God, they've got a lot further work to do, and I can say that because I was there. So Darfield site, they designed this very new site. They put in, all the whiz-bang best health and safety controls in there. So they had a chemical in one of the plants. They put in to the control room an alarm system around this chemical. While I was on the site, the system alarmed, and the guy overrode it. And I went, what's happening there? Can we go down and have a look? And he said, oh yeah, that thing alarms all the time. And it's been set up that way. Just a pain in the arse. They've set the level too low, like this. Oh yeah, okay. Can we go down and have a look? So we go down and have a look at this area, and there's a door, and right next to the door is a gas mask, and it says break this before entering next to it. And he says, oh, let's go and have a look. And he starts walking towards the door. Holy shit. What happens with this chemical? Oh, it can be quite explosive in high volumes. People pass out in low volumes. I'm like, oh, great. How would you know? He like this, he goes, well, I don't use that stuff there. It costs us $6,000 every time we break that thing and get those masks out. So there's no way I'm going to do that. So I just open the door. And if I can see it coming out, I know we've got a problem. Highly engineered system, all the right equipment, actually really good intent from management, and the critical controls were consistently being overridden. And that is the basis on which you must engage your staff. So they are exposed to the risks. If they don't understand the criticality of controls and they don't feel like they can deal with failures in those controls, then all is lost in terms of managing critical risk in New Zealand. You can do all the right things and you still won't get the right outcome. So the criticality of engaging staff in this is really, really, really important, and I think highly underestimated, because these are the people that are exposed to the risk.
Did you know your mouth can protect your health in the workplace from things like noise? Reckon you could do that, Maki?
Well, I don't know. It's not like I could stand up and say, anyone else worried about this noisy generator?
You just did.
When?
Then.
Oh yeah, but that was like a hypothetical scenario.
If you said it to me, you can say it at work.
You reckon? Yeah, why not?
Your mouth's a great bit of safety gear. Use it and start talking. WorkSafe, getting you home healthy and safe. That's what we're working for.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're really focused on this is actually, doesn't have to be overly complicated. The fact of the matter is I walked into a control room where I actually didn't even know what the chemical was. All I needed to do was ask a few dumb questions, and it was really obvious to me that we didn't have a culture that really fully understood the criticality of their controls and that would openly discuss or raise problems when there was issues with those controls. So when you're in the space, and just remember, if you're on a critical risk path, also in the critical risk space are all your health risks, which might not immediately be apparent, but are exposure to chemicals, exposure to dust. They are in the same category in terms of critical risks, and the way you control those critical risks is exactly the same, which with elimination controls as your priority. So again, just to emphasise the absolute importance of understanding what are your critical controls within this space, and ensuring you have an environment that allows your people to talk not only about the criticality of controls, but also what's happening in terms of failures in those controls. For example, you have a one-way system on site and people are repetitively from other contractors not using the one-way system. That is a pretty catastrophic failure in controls. In the last 3 weeks, rather devastatingly, we've had about 12 people die. About 8 of those have been related to forklifts versus people or trucks versus people in workplaces. We've got increased economic activity. You're in the same thing here, and we are seeing more and more interventions between people and contractors. Now, if you have worked on your site to really categorically set out one-way systems, to work out where vehicles and people can be separated from each other, that shouldn't be able to happen. But it is continuing to happen in New Zealand, so we're not focused on the right stuff. So just to end, I think we all want to ensure health and safety, so let's keep focusing on it. It is the right approach. There's nothing worse than going seeing families and telling them that one of their loved ones has died. And actually all of these accidents are preventable. There has never been an accident that I've investigated that has not been preventable, ever. and it's always a system problem that is at the heart of causing the accident. Sometimes there's a human piece in it, drugs for example, but generally that's the exception, very much the exception. Understand your critical risks, manage them, and absolutely involve your people.